Well, welcome to Dwell Community Church as we study the Bible here together. Thanks for tuning in as we study one of the most profound topics that we ever could, which is why we should have a belief in Jesus of Nazareth. Many modern people wonder if and why we should trust our lives, let alone our eternities, to Jesus of Nazareth. And they wonder if, faith is really just something that you choose to believe, or maybe it's a blind faith or a leap of faith or something of this sort. Well, if you're in that situation, I'm glad that you tuned in here this evening as we study this passage, which is one line of evidence from Isaiah 53. This is a passage which was written by the prophet Isaiah in the Hebrew Bible, which predates the time of Jesus by 7 centuries, 700 years before Jesus. And this actually picks up in Isaiah chapter 52, verse 13. There we read, "See, my servant will act wisely." Now, this concept of the servant of the Lord is mentioned in Isaiah 42, 49, and chapter 50. And he's weaved throughout the book of Isaiah. And this is his final mention in chapter 52:13 to chapter 53:12. We read that he will be raised and lifted up and highly exalted. Now, what's interesting about this language is that the last time that Isaiah used this language was in chapter 6, verse 1, where we read, "I saw the Lord," so God himself, "sitting on a throne, lofty and exalted." So the very attributes, the very language that is used of God himself is now being ascribed to the servant. And yet we go on. We read that there were many who were appalled at him. So God's very own person, God's very own man, his servant, who he considers to be lifted up and highly exalted, people were appalled at him. His appearance was so disfigured beyond that of any man, and his form was marred beyond all human likeness. So again, even though he was lifted up and highly exalted, he was beaten to a bloody pulp. We read in verse 15, "He will sprinkle many nations." What's interesting about this term in the Hebrew is this is the Hebrew term nazah. And this word is used by Moses, for example, in Exodus chapter 19, where he sprinkles the people with blood. It's also used of the high priest on the Day of Atonement when he would sprinkle nazah, the sacrificial animal's blood, over the atonement cover. And so the same word, the concept of bringing forgiveness through the death of an innocent, is now being used of this servant. It says as well that he will sprinkle many nations. So even though Isaiah is primarily focused on the nation of Israel, here we see that he's trying to look further outward into the many nations around him. Again, as I said, we saw that the servant of the Lord comes up in chapters 42, 49, and 50. And in chapter 49, verse 6, we read, "You will do more than restore the people of Israel to me." He says this of the servant. "I will make you a light to the nations." And then he says, "And you will bring my salvation to the ends of the earth." So what is it about this servant that his salvation, the light of God, the message of God, the love of God, would actually reach not just the nation of Israel, but would actually reach the entire globe? Who is this figure that's being predicted here? Well, as we study sociology today and people's beliefs, we read in a recent Pew study, a poll, which is trying to describe people's beliefs, that in 1 century, sub-Saharan Africa has seen a 60-fold increase of Christians. Just to give that some real concrete depth to it. This is going from 9 million Christians in 1910 to over 500 million Christians in 2010. Just to put this in perspective further, there are 80 million Christians in Nigeria alone. To put that in perspective, that's more than all of the Baptists in the entire United States, which is only 50 million. We read too as well of what's happening in China. I don't know if you've kept up with this. The complete shift in what's happening in China over the last 30 years. You see, in China in 1950, there were 1 million Christians. And then as different regimes came in, they kicked out all of the people that were foreign, that were bringing Christianity to these people. But to our surprise, we found that years later, the conservative estimate for the number of Christians in China is 67 million. And to give a more liberal estimate, it's somewhere between 130 and 150 million Christians in China. Now, the reason why there's such a disparity between those two figures is that many of the Chinese don't meet in official churches. They meet in these things called house churches, where they meet together in their homes rather than going to big services. We read for people who are on the ground that there's actually 30,000 people coming to Christ every day in China. Now, that should raise a question in our minds. Why is it that Christianity is actually surpassing the Communist Party membership in China to this day? Furthermore, why is it that across the globe, we see people in Latin America, South America, Asia, Africa, Europe, America, all of these good Gentile people have come to believe in the God of Israel? So we're reading from the Hebrew Bible currently. We believe in the God who revealed himself to the Jewish people. And we believe in, the Psalms as our poetry, the Proverbs as our wisdom literature. And why is it that so many Gentiles, something on the order of 2.4 billion Gentiles, have come to believe in the God of Israel? Why not the God of Molech or Baal or Zeus? Why the God of Israel? Well, it fits precisely with this picture here, that he would sprinkle many nations and reach many nations. We read again, kings will shut their mouths because of him. For what they were not told, they will see, and what they have not heard, they will understand. And then in chapter 53, we read this, who has believed our message, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? So even as this highly exalted, lofty, praised person comes on the scene, the immediate question is asked by Isaiah, who is going to believe in him? We read in verse 2, he grew up before him like a tender shoot and like a root out of dry ground. This is an allusion back to Isaiah chapter 11, where it says that there would be a shoot that would come out from Jesse's line. Jesse was the father of David, and David was kind of the prototype for the messianic line. And so this too is a messianic passage. Yet we read he had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. So even though he's, again, highly exalted and lofty, he doesn't look that good. He doesn't look like Jim Caviezel from The Passion of the Christ. This is not a very majestic Messiah. There's nothing on the outside that would make us think that he's very kingly. We continue, he was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and familiar with suffering. Like one from whom men hide their faces, he was despised, and we did not esteem him. Surely he took up our infirmities and carried our sorrows. Yet we considered him stricken by God, smitten by him, and afflicted. So according to Isaiah, all the people are going to be looking in at this servant of the Lord, and they're going to consider that actually it's his fault that he's being beaten to a bloody pulp. It's his fault that he's being tortured and killed, when really, in reality, in retrospect, they'll realize that actually it was our moral violations. It was our shame. It was our guilt being put onto him. We read he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was put onto him. By his wounds we are healed. We all, like sheep, have gone astray. Each of us has turned to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. In verse 7, we pick up, he was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before her shearers is silent, he did not open his mouth. Of course, at the kangaroo court that Jesus was forced into, everyone was giving contradictory testimony about Jesus, and they were lying about him, making up phony evidence and eyewitness testimony. And in a great act of history, Jesus remained silent. He didn't defend himself. He stood there and accepted the judgment of the people. By oppression and judgment, he was taken away. And who can speak of his descendants? For he was cut off from the land of the living. For the transgression of my people, he was stricken. Now, this is the word in Hebrew, gazar, which means always to mean to die a violent and unnatural death. So he's dead. He's dead as a doornail here. And we read in verse 9, just to build upon this, his grave was assigned with wicked men. Yet he was with a rich man in his death. Of course, Jesus, instead of being thrown into the common grave, he was buried in Joseph of Arimathea's tomb, a rich man. And we read as well, because he had done no violence, nor was there any deceit in his mouth. Jesus, of course, has been a hero, the absolute paradigm of nonviolent resistance in the world. And this prediction fits right in line with the character of Jesus, that there was no deceit, no lying, no violence. The Hebrew word here is Hamas, not to be confused with the terrorist organization, which is an acronym. This is Hamas, C-H-A-M-A-C, which means evil violence. And Jesus had never done that. He always turned the other cheek. He was loving even to his enemies and prayed for them. He never lied. He always told the truth. Yet it was the Lord's will to crush him and cause him to suffer. These people, Isaiah is predicting, as they look at this brutality, this brutal death, that this man is being, sliced into ribbons. He's being butchered like an animal. They're going to be looking at that thinking that he's getting what he deserves. When in reality, Isaiah is telling us 700 years in advance that this was God's will the entire time. He says, though the Lord makes his life a guilt offering, he will see his offspring and prolong his days, and the will of the Lord will prosper in his hand. What is this language of the guilt offering here? Well, this is the Hebrew term asham. This is used in Leviticus 6 and Leviticus 5 for the guilt offering that was specifically given for intentional, volitional sins. It's when someone was volitionally deciding to sin and they needed a guilt offering to pay for their sin, they would bring in an asham and met with a change of heart and a spilling of the animal blood, the innocent blood. The person was forgiven. What is tremendously interesting about this passage is that this isn't an animal that's being described here. It's a man. A man is going to be this guilt offering. This is why we read in verse 7, he was like a lamb led to the slaughter. That this figure, this servant of the Lord, would be like the sacrificial animal that would pay as a guilt offering for the people. We notice too that after this guilt offering occurs, it's then and only then that he sees his offspring. Remember earlier, he said, what about his descendants? He doesn't have any until the guilt offering occurs. And because of the guilt offering, Jesus has many sons and daughters. As many as received him, to them he gave the right to become children of God, according to John and the 1st chapter, verse 12. It also says that he will prolong his days. Now, wait a minute. Full stop. I thought we read that he was cut off. He was gazar from the land of the living. I thought we read that he was in a grave. I thought he was dead. And yet here it's saying that he will prolong his days. In verse 11, after the suffering of his soul, he will see the light of life and be satisfied. So what are we to make of this? Either they had a lot of smelling salts and heaters and they somehow brought this guy back to life, or this is the resurrection that's being described here. He was alive, he was dead, and he's alive again. Remember in verse 8, he was cut off from the land of the living, and yet here we see he's alive like he never was before. We continue, by his knowledge, my righteous servant will justify many, and he will bear their iniquities. Therefore, I will give him a portion among the great. He will divide the spoils with the strong, because he poured out his life unto death and he was numbered with the transgressors. For he bore the sin of many and made intercession for transgressors. Well, at this point, you can see why many people reading through this passage would believe that this refers to Jesus. I'll never forget years ago being invited to a dorm Bible study with a bunch of skeptics, and I printed out Isaiah 52:13 to 53:12, and just had the guys read it. It was 5 guys in a circle, and we read it together. And I said, if you could guess, who do you think this is referring to? So I asked the first guy, who do you think it's referring to? And he said, it sounds like Jesus. Second guy, yeah, probably Jesus. Third guy, fourth guy, fifth guy, that sounds like Jesus too. And I said, wow, you guys are blowing me away. That really gives me goosebumps. They said, why? And I said, well, because I think it's about Jesus too, but the only problem with that is that this was written 700 years before Jesus ever walked the face of the earth. So you can see why this has incredible evidential weight to why we would believe in Jesus. And yet, this is not without rejoinders and objections. One objection for this passage is that this can't refer to Jesus. It refers to the nation of Israel. After all, up until we read this passage in Isaiah 53, we continually read that Israel is God's servant. My own people is my servant. You, Israel, are my servant. O Israel, my servant. So again and again and again, we don't have to wonder who the servant of the Lord is. Isaiah himself tells us it's the nation of Israel. Well, does that carry weight? I see at least 3 different issues with this interpretation. First is a historical problem. Our earliest rabbinic teaching, this is Jewish sages and teachers and interpreters, they held that this passage referred to the Messiah. For example, we have a source from roughly AD 132. This is a commentary on the book of Isaiah where we read that, behold my servant Messiah. Messiah is wedged into Isaiah 52:13. Behold, my servant Messiah shall prosper. We read too in the 16th century, Rabbi Moshe Alshik, he says, our rabbis with one voice accept that the prophet is speaking of Messiah. So he's making a claim here, not just that he himself thinks this refers to the Messiah, but that all of the rabbis around him think it refers to the Messiah as well. In fact, where is the first historical occurrence where someone believed that Isaiah 53 referred to the nation of Israel? We don't see this until an interpreter by the name of Rashi, 1,000 years after the time of Christ. So let me point out, this isn't evidence. This isn't evidence. Perhaps all of these Jewish sages and rabbis and interpreters, perhaps they were all wrong. And perhaps this is about the servant Israel. But at the very least, this should get us to pause and ask the question, why is it that it took 1,000 years for someone to come up with the idea that this isn't referring to the Messiah, but instead to Israel? Which brings me to my second problem with this interpretation. In this passage, as we read, we see that after Isaiah 49:6, that there is a divergence, a splitting apart of the nation of Israel and the servant. So as where at first they were just one person being described or one entity, after Isaiah 49:6, we see that the nation of Israel is split from the servant of the Lord. For example, we read, it is too small a thing that you should be my servant to whom? To the Gentile nations, to Assyria, to Egypt, to Babylon, to whom? Well, it says, too small a thing that you should be my servant to raise up the tribes of Jacob and to restore the preserved ones of Israel. You see, this can't be the nation of Israel because the servant is supposed to raise up the nation of Israel. So too, we read in Isaiah 53, verse 6, all of us, like sheep, have gone astray. Each of us has turned to his own way. This is a poetic device in Hebrew literature, which is referred to as intensification. It'd be like saying, we're going to go out there and we're going to annihilate this other team. And then it says, we're not going to give them a single run. On the one hand, it's general, it's very general and big, and then on the other hand, it gets very particular, very intensified. And so all of us, and then it says each of us, each and every one of us, has turned to his own way. But the Lord has caused the iniquity of us all to fall on him. This can't be Israel. Otherwise, we'd have to read it like this. The Lord has caused the iniquity of Israel to fall on Israel. See, that's just not a common sense interpretation. Furthermore, in verse 8, we read that he, which is the servant, was struck down for the rebellion of my people, the nation. My people, this is the loyal name that God gives to the nation of Israel. What's called the covenantal name, where God makes a promise with the nation of Israel, and he always calls them my people. Here it says that the servant was struck down for the people of God, for the nation of Israel. And we see many more problems. I'll just give you a few. Verse 3, he's called a man of sorrows, not a nation of sorrows. Verse 9, it said that he has no violence, no Hamas. When in Israel's history do we ever read that they don't have any violence? When? At what point do they not have any violence? We don't see it in the time of the kings. We don't see it in the time of the judges. We don't see it in Isaiah's time. In the 8th century BC, Isaiah 1, he says that you have blood on your hands from murder. As we flash forward throughout Israel's history, they're constantly fighting. The Maccabean revolt in the 160s BC, the Jewish war in AD 66, Simon Bar Kokhba's revolt, AD 132, all the way down to the present day. How on earth could this be about the nation of Israel? Instead, verse 11, this is about God's righteous servant. Now here, I just want to point out that I would include myself here as well. Who could we say? What nation could we say has no violence, has no unrighteousness, that's considered completely righteous, completely morally flawless? Are we really to believe that this is referring to a nation? Now, someone might ask, well, that's fair. And yet the question that comes about from this is, why was he cursed? Well, this leads to a third problem, a theological problem. You see, in one of his covenants or his contracts with his people, he promised to bless Israel if they were righteous. And he promised to curse Israel if they were unrighteous in Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 28. So here's a theological problem. God promises to bless Israel if they're righteous, and yet the servant is righteous and he isn't blessed, he's cursed. So unless God is actually taking back his promise to bless when people follow his moral prescriptions, then this would actually be breaking God's own character, his own promise to his people. Now someone might ask, well, why is it that before Isaiah 49:6 that the two were one? Why is it that the servant was identified as the nation of Israel? To this, I would say that the nation of Israel is represented by the servant. So where it starts off as the nation, a kingdom of priests, Exodus 19, that we're supposed to be a light to the world, that it starts off as a nation, but it finally culminates in a righteous remnant that dwindles down to a single individual, Jesus, the Israelite. He was the one who not only came from Israel, who was an Israelite, but actually represented the nation in being a light to the world. We might consider it something like this. Imagine if you perhaps were reading the paper and reluctantly you read that the president declares war. And you think to yourself, well, I don't want to read that. I'm in too bad of a mood already. And so you flip to another paper and it says that the United States declares war. Well, would you say that those two newspapers were contradicting each other? Well, surely not. Of course, this is describing that the president represents the nation as one of its citizens. And so too with Jesus. He represents the nation of Israel. Well, another objection that's raised is perhaps that this prophecy or prediction was written after the time of Christ. Is this plausible? Well, this is just absolutely not plausible because we actually have a document of the entire book of Isaiah. This was found in the Dead Sea Scrolls in Qumran, the Qumran community in Cave 1, and this dates at least to 150 years before the time of Jesus. We have the full scroll. And when you get to Isaiah 51, you move on to Isaiah 52, and then Isaiah 53 and Isaiah 54, just as we had in our later manuscripts. Now, some people have said, well, you said that this was written 700 years beforehand. I did. I'm saying our earliest manuscript is from 150 BC. So whether it's 700 years in advance or 200 years in advance, this is certainly a prediction. This would be like predicting the most important human being who would ever live for the year 2220, 200 years from now. Would it be any easier to make that prediction 200 years in advance or 700 years in advance? Neither. I mean, one's quantitatively different, but neither are qualitatively different. This does not get away with the predictive element of this passage. Other people have asked the question, maybe the disciples or perhaps even Jesus himself self-fulfilled this prediction. After all, they had their Bibles and they had Isaiah 53. They quote it in the New Testament something like 40 times. And perhaps the disciples themselves actually tried to self-fulfill this prediction. Well, there's really serious difficulties with this argument. For one, to make the understatement of the century, this was not in their self-interest. Cicero refers to crucifixion. He was a first century BC Roman statesman. As, he says, there is no fitting word that can possibly describe so horrible a deed as crucifixion. Josephus, who himself had seen tens of thousands of crucifixions, said that it was the most wretched of deaths. And so we have to ask ourselves the question, why is it that Jesus of Nazareth would go through the excruciating torture of crucifixion? Why is it that he would be butchered and hung up like meat, like an animal, on a Roman cross? What benefit did this give him? I would love to be part of that conversation where the disciples were trying to convince Jesus to self-fulfill this prophecy. Well, perhaps it was the apostles, Jesus' disciples. Well, there's difficulty with that too. The apostle Paul died by beheading in AD 64 in Rome. So too, one of Jesus' other closest disciples was the apostle Peter, who was crucified at the same time. And finally, last but not least, was Jesus' little brother James, half-brother, who was stoned and clubbed to death in Jerusalem. So what would motivate these three disciples, who were Jesus' closest disciples, to not benefit from any kind of power or prestige or financial prowess? What would motivate them to go through suffering and pain and even martyrdom for their beliefs? What's behind it? For any kind of conspiracy, they need to get something out of it. What did they get out of it? And secondly, another difficulty with this objection is that no one in the first century Palestinian world believed in an expectation for a crucified Messiah before the time of Christ. As I said earlier, those citations only come from after the time of Christ, but they did not occur before the time of Jesus. So, if you were to try and start a new religion, what would be the way to do it? If you were trying to fake some kind of messianic kingdom, how would you do it? Would you appeal to the prophecies about a reigning ruler and a conquering king, Daniel 7 and Isaiah 9, where he comes in as a king and the government's on his shoulders? Or would you appeal to passages like Daniel 9, 24 through 27, which says that the Messiah would be killed? Isaiah 53 that says that he would be pierced through and die and be marred and bloodied. Not only would it not be in your self-interest, this wouldn't be palatable to either the Greco-Roman world or the Jewish world. So if they were to have tried to fake some kind of conspiracy, this would have been the worst story they could have given. Well, now that we've addressed the head, we might as well address the heart. What are the spiritual lessons we can learn from this passage? What is it that we learn about spiritual reality from this passage in particular? Well, for one, biblical faith is not blind faith. I've only shown you one line of evidence for Jesus. There's many more. There's a reason that so many thinking people today are Christians and also top gear academicians and academics in universities all across the world. There's nothing about biblical faith that needs to be blind or that needs to be somehow ignorant. Biblical faith is based on evidence. It's not based on the absence of evidence. So too, from this passage, we read that Jesus heals the heart of the very human condition. I don't know where you're at right now in your life, and I don't know what kind of suffering that you're going through. I can only imagine. And for me, I always have hated it when people have come up and told me, when I was going through grief or suffering, that I know what you're going through. I know exactly how you feel. No, you don't. And I don't know how you're feeling right now. But I'll tell you who does know is Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ is the one who entered into our world of violence and racism and sexism and brutality and evil, and he took on human flesh. And he didn't defend himself. He let himself die. He was beaten nearly to death, and then he was strung to a Roman cross. Jesus understands the suffering that you're going through more than anyone that we could ever even imagine. And Jesus speaks to the core human condition. Many people have a sense of emptiness in their lives. Now, this isn't all the time. Sometimes we go out, we make a lot of money, we have a lot of pleasure, we have a lot of thrills, and yet when the thrills are gone, it kind of sets in. It kind of returns, that sense of an aching void of the soul. What will fill that void? In these kind of quiet times, we have the question, who am I? Why do I matter? What difference does it make that I even exist? Where am I headed after death? And Jesus speaks, again, directly to the heart of the human condition. He knows the answers to these questions. It's interesting to me, it's actually baffling to believe that you could have so many intelligent, brilliant, accomplished, professional people in the world, and they've got everything planned out in their lives. They've got their stock portfolios, they've got their retirement and their education, and everything's figured out, and yet they've never thought about what's going to happen after this life is over. Think about that for a second. We're going to spend something like 80 years on this planet, and we're going to spend eternity someplace else. In fact, most people believe in life after death, and it makes you wonder, how is it that you are going to get there? On what merit? On what basis? If you were traveling to Hawaii for a week, would you just show up to the airport without a passport or money or any identification and just assume that you could get on that flight to go to Hawaii? Well, many people are assuming, they're banking their entire eternities that they'll be able to get up and see God after death and that he's just going to accept them. Well, if a vacation in Hawaii costs thousands of dollars for a week, how much does eternity in heaven cost us? Well, from this passage, we learn that it cost us nothing less than the death of Jesus Christ. That when God put a price tag on our forgiveness, the price tag was the death of his own Son. To put this simply, God doesn't want you to give and give and give and to suffer and suffer and suffer for him. Instead, he wants to suffer and to give something to you here right now. The God of the Bible is, in kind of a conspiratorial way, very unique from other world religions. Other world religions say that you have to pray more, you have to be a good person, you've got to give more money, you've got to give, you've got to suffer, you've got to even die for your faith. And God says, I don't want you to die for me. I want you to accept that I died for you. I have a gift for you. I love you. I paid the incommensurable price, the unbelievable price of Jesus Christ to come into your life. The question is, are you going to receive that? Paul says in 2 Corinthians 5:21, God made the one who did not know sin to be sin for us. So this is the exchange here. The one who didn't know sin, Jesus, and us who definitely know sin, so that in him we would become the righteousness of God. And so what he's saying here is that Jesus had righteousness and we had sin, and Jesus gave us his righteousness and we gave him our sin. A great exchange, a terrible exchange, where Jesus was saying that I want to give this to you and I want to take on the punishment that you deserve. I remember hearing the story of a young woman who was getting baptized, which is basically just a profession of your faith. It's when you receive Christ, that's a personal issue of the heart. And yet we want to get baptized and publicly tell people what happened and how God changed our lives. And this young woman was kind of funny. She got up in front of her whole group of friends, Christian friends, and they were about to baptize her. And the person leading the meeting was saying, I just want to run through a few questions before we dunk you in the water. And she said, sure. And the guy said, well, do you believe that Jesus was the Son of God? And she said, yes. Yeah, I do. And he said, do you believe that he died? And she said, yes. And he said, do you believe that he rose from the dead? And she said, yes. And he said, do you believe that Jesus was without sin? And she said, no. And the guy said, wait a minute. No, do you believe that Jesus had no sin? And she said, no. And he asked it a third and a fourth time. He thought maybe he was saying it wrong. And until finally he said, well, what is it that you do believe? And she said, well, of course Jesus had sin. He had my sin. And at that moment, the man said, I think you're ready to get baptized. This is the very heart of the Christian message. Love and forgiveness, acceptance, a relationship with God coming into your life, loving you like no one ever has before, giving him your sin and receiving his righteousness. The only question before you is the question that Isaiah asks us in verse 1. Who has believed our message? See, as we read through this prophecy, Isaiah predicted that some people would look at this and say, whatever, I'll think about that some other time. And yet here we're seeing that the person who wrote this and predicted it actually predicted that some people would turn away from this. They wouldn't believe. Instead of accepting Jesus' righteousness, they would trust in self-righteousness. And if you're here with us, listening, watching, receive Christ into your heart. Open up your heart. Lay down your pride. Have the courage to have him come into your life. Trust in him. Stop trusting in yourself and come to meet Jesus personally here tonight. Let me pray for us. Heavenly Father, I want to pray right now for those people who are hurting and suffering, who have that sense that the world is just spinning around them. I pray that they would have had a sense of security and peace hearing your word taught tonight. And I especially, Lord, want to pray for those people who are interested, that their curiosity was piqued by this evidence for you. I pray that they would take the next step, which is just to not to talk to somebody else or talk to themselves, but really just to turn and talk to you. Go right to the source. Open up their hearts and receive the gift of forgiveness that you have to offer. And I pray for each and every one of those people in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, thanks for tuning in, and we hope to see you soon.